Hello, this is my cute GVGV pink dress, which I got when I was just like a tiny little bit smaller than I am right now. And it fits, but it just gives me like a tight trouser syndrome. If I eat any food, it's kind of uncomfortable. So I'm going to make it a little bit bigger. Side seams aren't really just like a straight down seam all the way, as you can see in the armpit here especially. So I'm gonna have to use some like of my own cutting techniques to get in here and make an even shape on the side. What I have to do is add a side seam to the sleeve where there isn't one. I'm going to level it out from the hem of the sleeve and just draw a straight line from there until the armpit where there is an actual side seam, and make sure those two lines from the bottom hem to the side seam match and cut. I have to do a little bit of unpicking here because I don't want to cut straight down into the side seam there yet. I need to do a little bit of unpicking and then undo the side seam. Then I'll unpick the side seam. Once the side seam is unpicked, I have to deal with the side of the skirt, which also happens to not have a side seam in this garment. For some reason, it's like 10 centimeters to the side of the actual side seam. Interesting pattern cutting. So again, I have to go down from the side seam all the way to the bottom of the hem, making sure it's a pretty equal straight line. I'm using my ruler here and a Clover chalkener pen to chalk the line that I will then cut. Because this dress has one side seam at the kind of waist to armpit, it has seam allowance where I've unpicked it, but where I've cut a seam into the sides of the arm and the skirt, there isn't that extra seam allowance. So I'm just going to skip the side seam allowance when I'm sewing, and just where I use 1 centimeter seam allowance everywhere else, I will just use 2 centimeters seam allowance there at the side. Now for the sleeve, I just wanted to try something out basically, so I'm kind of cutting it in half. So I marked my line out with a ruler, making sure it's even, and then I spread it open over some fabric I want to add. This is roughly around the elbow point. I did try it on and get a rough idea of where that is. And then I'm just drawing a pattern here. I decided to use a white marker because the chalk wasn't really showing up, as you can see. So instead of making one big rectangle to make the sleeve longer, I decided to make a 2-piece pattern, which kind of, where the elbow will poke out, is rounded instead of straight. I'm kind of making 2 kind of half moon shapes that all sew together, so it kind of pops out. I'm using a coffee cup as a paperweight to cut as well. You can pin your patterns together. It's something I sometimes do if I feel like it, but this fabric I'm using is very stable and I'm not really doing anything precise, like tailoring to fit me like a glove, so I'm just kind of winging it a little bit and experimenting as well. Checking to see if these pieces I cut lined up, by the way, and then I'm going to do a French seam on this curved edge where the elbow will be. So I'm just using about like a 4 or 5 millimeter seam allowance, wrong sides together. Once I sew that, I'll trim it. Fold it so that it's right sides together. At this stage you should probably iron it flat, but again, because I'm not really being really precise and this fabric is really stable, I'm just kind of pressing it flat with my fingers, and then also again with like a 4 or 5 millimeter seam allowance to finish off this French seam. This prevents it from fraying and it also looks really nice. Unfortunately, throughout this video you'll see I can't always use a French seam because I'm adding pockets to this as well, but there are other alternatives to prevent your garment from fraying, such as overlocking, adding binding, or using pinking shears is another good option. And I'm just sewing the sleeve to the new addition, again using a French seam here. I am curious to know if anyone would like a video about French seaming or like further details about the techniques I'm using, but I just kind of assumed like if you're coming to my channel you might already know how to sew, and I'm just kind of here to teach you upcycling and mending. If it's something you're interested and you don't want to watch anyone else do it, please tell me and I will consider making a video about that. Because I undid the side seam there and cut a new seam into the armpit, some of that had to be unpicked. So I'm just re-sewing areas that I've unpicked, and then I can sew the new side seam together. But first, we're going to add a piece of fabric. So I've got my fabric here that I want to add to make this dress just a little bit bigger. I'm just deciding how much I want to add, including seam allowance. Here it's about, I think, 6 to 8 centimeters. So I just snip my fabric there and then rip it. You can see I am cutting 2 here because initially I did think I would edit this dress 2 times, but in the end I decided to just do it on one side and make an asymmetrical style. Then here with the spread fabric with mushrooms, I'm just putting my hand over it and cutting out a pocket. This is really basic, easy way to make a pocket, and unfortunately because of the fabric I was using, which is my grandma's old fabric, probably from the 1960s, there wasn't much left of it, so the pocket is a little bit smaller than I'd like. It doesn't really hold my phone very well, but I do like to have a pocket just in case for my travel card or my keys or something, so I'm just adding 1 pocket anyway because all dresses should have pockets, and I think it's really infuriating that they don't come with pockets, or if they do, they're really tiny and your hand can't even fit in them. What's that about? And now I'm just doing a French seam of the pocket pieces, which is a combination of the red mushroom fabric and the fabric I'm using to add into my side seam to grow this garment. I do actually want to make some videos about adding pockets to garments because, as I said, it's infuriating that women's wear often doesn't feature pockets at all or that are big enough. So I do intend to make a pocket video or 2 or 3 or 100 at some point. Then I sewed the pocket opening pieces to their respective sides of the dress. In this situation, the red is attached to the pink and the purpley kind of watercolory fabric is sewn to the same fabric. I hope that makes sense. Again, I'm assuming that if you're watching this, you hopefully know how to sew and know how to make pockets. If you don't, please shout at me and I will make more videos about how to do these things. Now I'm adding the side panel to make it bigger, but before I just go ahead and sew it, I decided that rather than undoing the top stitching and hem of the pink garment, I'm just going to hem the purple fabric separately and then attach it to the pink dress. I had some conflict personally about doing it the other way of unpicking the hem because to make it look really nice, I felt that I would have to completely take the hem apart and redo it, which I really didn't want to do. And you don't have to. I could have just partially undone it, added the panel, and then partially re-hemmed it, but I just thought that might look really ugly because of the color of the thread would be different for the purple and the pink, and I just thought it would be too messy. So the downside of doing it the way I've done it is that where that new side seam is, you can kind of see your side seam from the hem. So even if you're wearing the clothing, you might occasionally get a pop of seam allowance from underneath. Maybe you don't care about it, it's fine if you don't. In the end, I did do a little bit of hand stitching just to hold it down, which you can see at the end. I'm using needles as pins here, by the way, because when I moved to Japan, I forgot to bring pins for some reason, but I brought a whole load of needles. I'm just using what I got to work with. So I'm sewing the side seam now, and you'll see once I get to this red mushroom fabric, I pause. That's where the pocket is. I sew up right until that point, stop, reverse, cut it off, and then at the other side of the pocket, I start sewing again. And then here I stop to do the hem at the bottom of the new side seam. I didn't do this beforehand because I wanted to make sure that sewing from the side seam hem of the armhole all the way down past the pocket to the bottom hem of the skirt, that it was the totally perfect correct length. So that meant I sewed all the way until I got close to the hem, stopped, measured it all out, folded it up properly, making sure it's super matte, and then sew the hem into this purpley fabric and then finish the side seam. I could have probably measured this, but sometimes fabric behaves weirdly, and like these two fabrics I'm putting together aren't exactly the same. So if there was any stretching that was going to happen or something, I just wanted to do it this way to make sure it really matched at the end. On the side seam, I did do a zigzag stitch. I don't have an overlocking machine. It doesn't look very beautiful, but I don't want this to fray. I could have used binding, but I didn't really want to make it bulky, and I kind of also didn't really want to spend the time to do that. One thing I did add kind of at the last minute was a little piece of elastic at the waist on the purple fabric where the waist seam is, because it was like a little bit too big then, and I wanted it to have some kind of stretch and flexibility at the side seam, so I just top stitched that elastic at the waist. I did do some hand stitching to keep the side seams down like I told you. Nothing really fancy, and if you have a similar dress to mine and end up doing something similar to a dress or a skirt or anything, this is an option for keeping it down. I really like that on one side it looks like just a normal cute pink dress from GVGV. Then when you turn to the side, it's like, oh, hang on, it's not just a plain pink dress. It has a funny elbow and a side seam.